You're about to enjoy the last episode of Season 1 of the TWiP Apps podcast. Don't worry, we'll be back in early 2017. We figured the end of 2016 made for a good time to take a little break, step back, and ensure that everything about the show is as good as it can possibly be. Don't unsubscribe. The show will continue right here where it left off. For now, sit back and enjoy this very special show with my good friend, Nik Bhatt. Today on TWiP Apps, we learn that the macOS RAW engine is far more powerful than you may have realized, and how to finally tap into it. There are many RAW decoders on the market from companies like Adobe, Phase, DxO, Macphun, and of course Apple. Apple's RAW engine is loved by many, but since the demise of Aperture, we haven't had a way to truly access it. Sure, Photos uses the macOS RAW engine, but you have no control over it. At least you didn't until now. Raw Power by Gentleman Coders is a Photos extension and standalone app that gives you complete access to the macOS RAW engine in an intuitive interface that'll feel very familiar to Aperture users, largely because of who wrote it. To find out more, you'll just have to watch the show. I'm PhotoJoseph, and this is TWiP Apps. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of TWiP Apps. I'm your host, PhotoJoseph, and today my guest is a personal friend of mine, a Mr. Nik Bhatt, who is the founder and gentleman of Gentleman Coders. Nik, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Joseph.
It's great to have you on here. So,
Same here.
Our history goes back quite a ways, and so I also want to preface this by saying that I'm going to skip my standard wrap-up opinion at the end because Nik and I go way back. We're good buddies, and even if I hated his software, I wouldn't tell him. No, that's not true. I would.
Please tell me.
I would absolutely tell him. I would tell him for sure, just to make sure that his software rocked, and it does. But Nik and I go back to the days of Apple. Nik was the senior engineer. I screwed it up. What is it? What was it?
Senior Director of Engineering, or you call me the lead engineer.
Sorry, Senior Director of Engineering / lead engineer / the man behind it at Apple for Aperture. So if you loved Aperture, this was the man. If you hated Aperture, it was not his responsibility at all. He had nothing to do with it whatsoever.
That's right.
Now, obviously, Aperture is developed by a large team of people, but he had the keys there, and Nik did a fantastic job. And they didn't kill Aperture because Nik left. Let's leave that right there. That is very true.
Yes, let's be very clear about that.
Let's be very clear about it. It is not his fault. For those of you who are still lamenting the loss of that, myself included. Mm-hmm. So, but today, Nik has left Apple and he has started his own company, and he has an awesome app that he's going to be showing us today. Nik, give us a little bit of background. How long ago did you leave Apple?
About a year ago.
It's been a year now. Okay.
Yeah,
so
it really has.
Yeah, time flies, right? So you left Apple a year ago. You founded Gentleman Coders and decided to start making apps because, what the heck? There's not enough people making apps these days. You decided to jump into the fray. So what are you doing? What are you doing for us that is different than what everybody else is doing out there?
Well, so what I've done here is brought the power and flexibility of Aperture's raw processing, but brought it to the Photos application, which doesn't have that set of features. Now, if you're familiar with Aperture's raw fine-tuning, some of those controls as well as some other ones are now available through this photo extension that I built. However, unlike the raw fine-tuning that's in Aperture, all of the adjustments in raw power are real-time. So you get power, you get speed, and you get basically unparalleled access to Apple's raw engine. And that engine is the same engine that powers Aperture and Photos.
Okay, so this is the same code. You're not rewriting RAW. You're not redoing RAW. You're using Apple's RAW engine, but you're giving us access to the raw tools, for lack of a better term. You're going all the way down to giving us access to things you don't get even in Photos itself.
That's right. So it's using the same engine, the same technology that sits underneath Photos and Aperture, but now you get access to all the controls that are actually present to control the developing of that raw image. So you can really make fixes and improvements to images that are simply impossible to do in the Photos application itself. And in fact, you can make some changes in raw power, which you couldn't make in Aperture either. So it actually brings you functionality which was not even present in Aperture.
Wow, that's a bold claim. That's pretty awesome. So we're looking.
I plan to prove it to you.
And you're going to prove it to me. And this is of course just a plugin for Photos. So we now have the ability to do things in Photos that we couldn't even do in Aperture. So for kind of the first time, we now have we've now made part of Photos, at least not everything, but part of Photos more powerful than its predecessor.
That's right.
Well, that's pretty impressive. Well, I think we just need to jump into this, quit gabbing, and take a look at it. But before we do that, let's take a quick break for a word from our sponsor.
Hey, TWiP listeners. As you've probably heard by now, I'm running a workshop in Oaxaca, Mexico in January, and there's a few seats left, and I'd love if some of you could come along. Head over to photojoseph.com/workshops, where you can learn everything you need to know about it and hopefully sign up. With any luck, I'll see some of you in Mexico in January.
And we're back with Nik Bhatt, the gentleman coder. Nik, you've got an awesome plugin extension. I guess they're not really called plugins, right? They're called extensions, technically, for the Photos app to give us some of that power that we are oh so missing from the days of Aperture. Let's just jump right in. Let's take a look. Let's switch over to the demo. What do you got here?
All right. So this is the Photos application, and there's a raw image here, which, as you can see, if you look in the center where the waves are, it's really, really severely overexposed.
Definitely.
Now, as you mentioned, this runs as an extension, what we might call a plugin, but an extension to Photos. So it's available in Edit. You go here and you pick Raw Power. So what that does is it loads it into the extension. And the first thing you want to notice is it looks exactly the same as it did in Photos, and that's because it shares the same raw engine. Okay, so let's look at that same image there, and we'll take a quick tour of the interface on the right.
Okay.
It should look pretty familiar, especially people who used Aperture. There's a lot of the same concepts in the workflow are there. So at the top here, we've got rotate and flip, show original, some zoom controls. It's got a nice, nice speedy zoom here. There's a histogram. Now I'll show you these indicators at the top here. These those four kind of lights, and so those are those service clipping indicators. They tell you what channel you're clipped in, and they're also live. So as you make adjustments, they're continuously updating.
Oh, interesting.
In addition, they serve another purpose, which is that's the control for hot and cold pixels. So one of the great features that was in Aperture was the ability to show the areas that were overexposed and the areas that were underexposed.
Sure.
And so that's done here by clicking on one of these buttons. So this first one here shows you the hot and cold pixels. And so hot red, blue cold. Now one of the differences here is that I've tinted actually the colors for red and blue so that they're visible in very bright areas. One of the things that often is a problem with hot pixels is if you have, say, a blown out red area, you actually can't see the hot pixels because the red of the hot pixels and the red are the same. This is actually toned down so that it's visible.
Oh, okay. Makes sense. Okay. Cool.
In addition, these three other indicators actually are the per channel clipping indicators. So for example, this will show you what's clipped just in red or just in blue or green. So you can actually get very specific information about the hot pixels per channel if that's important to you. Because sometimes if you just look at the hot pixels overall, you might say, I really want to get rid of all those hot areas, when really you may not care because of the color or the overall look of the picture. So that's why those are specific.
And and by knowing this, you know that you could go in and manipulate just the blue channel, I think it was in this one that's totally blown out, if needed, to pull that back.
Exactly. And as I'll show later, there's a full curves adjustment. And so you could use that curves adjustment to manipulate just the red, just the green, and just the blue channel.
Got it. Very good. Okay.
Okay, so we've got your histogram here, and now we'll talk about raw processing. So now raw processing is really the heart of raw power because that's the thing that gives you access to all of the controls in Apple's raw engine. So we'll kind of walk through those for a second here. So the first one is this one called Boost, and Boost is probably the most important control that's in this application in raw power, because what it does is it gives you control over Apple's look itself. And so raw processing includes, there's correction for noise and moire or sharpening, but there's also a certain thing that is the look. And every manufacturer, every camera vendor, and every developer like Adobe or Apple has their own look to their raw images. Boost is a slider which actually controls the amount of that look that's applied. If you go to 0, It says, make the image kind of flat, neutral. I'm going to do everything. And if you max it out, it says, make the image look as nice as the software knows how to make it. Now, in our case, because we are working with all of these controls, sometimes we want it fully boosted, sometimes not at all, and sometimes in the middle.
Okay.
Now, the important thing about boost is the way that boost affects other adjustments in a way that maybe is not well understood. In an image like this one, when there's a lot of bright areas, boost has an interesting effect on things, which is it tries to make the image not only colorful and bright or saturated, brighter. So what people would do typically in Aperture or Photos or any other application is they would go look primarily in these tone adjustments, exposure, highlights, shadows, recovery. And what you might do here is say, oh, you know what I'm going to do is I'll turn down the exposure a little bit, and then maybe I'll bring up recovery some. And I'm getting some of that detail back. You can see it's getting back. It's a little muddy, though. And that is basically because the boost slider or the boost filter is fighting with you. As you make the image a little darker, it makes the image a little brighter because it's trying to make the image bright.
Is it compensating as you go?
It's continuously running, right? So basically, it's boosting the image. It's looking at the image and it's trying to make it bright again. It's kind of like its own curve, right? So as you bring it down, it's counteracting some of the impact that you're having on the image, which is why in Aperture, for example, or other applications, you often would find it hard to actually bring down the highlights quite the way you expect it to, or perhaps quite the way that, say, just a straight exposure might have done for you.
Oh, very interesting. That actually makes a lot of sense to some of the things that I've seen before. So I don't think I ever understood that was quite how it works. So excellent.
And Boost was an underused slider in Aperture, and I promoted it to the top because I want to make sure that people really took advantage of it as much as possible.
Awesome.
And in fact, there's a little help thing here that actually you can click on that's right here that actually tells you what Boost is all about and when to use it, because I think it's so important.
Okay.
So what we're going to do is we're going to reset all that stuff. And I'm going to use Boost instead. And so the first thing I'm going to do with Boost is I'm going to bring it down some. Now, it does darken the image a little bit. As I mentioned, Boost tends to make things brighter. And maybe about halfway. Now, you'll notice it didn't really bring back a lot of detail in the waves, but that's not its job. What we're doing here is basically preventing Boost from doing too much.
Okay.
So now, if we just bring up recovery just a little bit, you'll see that detail comes right back right away. And I didn't have to really drop exposure or mess around with other filters. It just looked good quickly.
Okay.
Now, if you look at the clipping indicators at the top, you'll see now that the red clipping indicator has now gone away, which means you're no longer clipped in red at all, still in green and blue. Now I can turn that on and kind of look at the area, see how most of the waves now are just fine.
Right. And there's a certain amount of acceptable clipping for sure when you're
right, exactly. So
like
one might want to turn recovery down a little bit and get some more of that bright back in so that you get white. I mean, you don't want to just get rid of all the highlights all the time necessarily. Sometimes you really want to have a balance.
Yeah, because that's part of what adds to the high contrast and the texture of the image is having, even if it is blown out, it's pure white anyway. Who cares if it's clipping? Once it's white, it's white. Exactly. Same thing with the black shadows.
Exactly. Now, I should also mention that these sliders, if you hold the Command key down, you saw the hot and cold pixels. This one, if I hold the Command key down, I'll actually get Photoshop style. I'm holding down the wrong Command key. That's great. So if I hold down the Command key, you'll see kind of Photoshop style clipping indicators.
I've always found that to be so useful.
Yeah, so all of the filters inside the tone adjustment respond to that sort of thing. So you can actually see very clearly what's happening. And so as I bring exposure or recovery up, you'll see that I get rid of a lot of that stuff very quickly. So
what is the difference?
Hot and cold pixels.
What is the difference between recovery and highlights? Because you think of highlights as highlight recovery. That would be the full name of it, right? So reducing the brightness in the highlights. But what is recovery doing that's different than highlights?
So highlights, they're similar filters. So they both work on the bright parts of the image. Recovery is a filter that actually I wrote for this specifically, and what it does is it's purely a selective exposure. So highlights is trying to do a bunch of things to kind of control those highlight areas without making the image too dark. And recovery does that by just affecting exposure. So it's basically a selective exposure on just the bright parts. It's a simpler filter that acts exactly like exposure. So in some respects, I find it easier to understand what it's doing.
Okay. Makes sense. Got it. Thank you.
All right. So we've gone through this image and we've already made it nice just basically by using raw processing and recovery. I should go through here and just give you a quick view of some of the other adjustments because a lot of them are really important. So Black Boost works on just the boost curve for dark areas. You've got the black floor, noise reduction, and special sharpening and contrast adjustments that apply really early in the raw processing as part of the early debarring process. So instead of happening afterward, they happen really, really, really early. And so you can get some very, very nice results without having to sharpen aggressively later on. There's white balance with sampling. You saw the tone area and some simple adjustments for, saturation, vibrancy, contrast, stuff like that.
Got it.
Okay. So
what is actually no, I scratched that. Go ahead. Sorry.
Since raw power is an extension of photos, it is non-destructive so that if I save the changes here, what it does is it makes a full-size JPEG, gives it back to photos. So now you're seeing the image just as it was rendered in raw power. But if I go back into raw power, then it reloads and I see all of my adjustments are here again. So I can continue right where I left off, completely non-destructively.
Now that is only going to apply if you haven't done anything else in Photos, right? If you do something else to Photos, it is going to affect that JPEG. And so if you then were to open that back up
so
in here.
If I go in and I do something like I apply a vignette or something like that in Photos to this image, then I can no longer go back into raw power because it's now, as you said, modified the JPEG that came in from the plugin.
But you could, because Photos does have versioning, you could create a new version of that before you went and took it off somewhere else. If you spent a whole lot of time messing with the raw image in raw power to get it to look perfect as a perfect raw image, now I want to go be fancy with it in another app, another plugin or another extension or just other tools in Photos. If I created a version of that first, I would have that corrected raw one to go back to open back up and continue to tweak.
Exactly. That's a great way of doing this, is use the duplicate command to try out different things.
Great. Perfect. Alrighty.
Okay. So let me go to another image here. This is an underexposed image. So in this case, we'll again go back into the extension. All right. So in this case, you'll see those clipping indicators are all off because the image is underexposed. And what I'm going to do here is, because it's underexposed, there's no need for me to drive boost down because boost is actually helping me here make the image actually look a little nicer.
Okay.
So I'm going to use curves. And so curves is a really full-featured, powerful implementation.
Now you'll probably remember, I mean, maybe you won't, I don't know, but maybe you remember back Aperture 3, right? Isn't that where curves went in? And I know, and I had left Apple already. I wasn't there anymore when 3 was released. I was there when it was being developed. But when I didn't know curves was going in or not, and then when I saw it, and I called you. I said, "Thank you, thank you for putting curves in. It was so important to me, and it was a really good implementation of curves, really good."
Well, a lot of those same concepts are here, and so because I did that curves implementation, and I was really happy to get those nice compliments from you. So I think there's a lot of very important features there that I wanted to bring here.
Okay.
So if we look at them, there's some standard ones like an auto black and an auto RGB. So what that does is basically provide contrast in the case of auto black, and auto RGB provides contrast and corrects for color casts.
Gotcha.
So I'll start with that. So if I just click on this one, then what I get is I just get a brighter image. If you look at the curve histogram down here, you can see the black and the white points are now pinned at basically at the edge of the histogram.
Sure.
Now, if I use auto RGB though, what it'll do instead is you'll get that color that comes back, because what it's doing now is it's actually adjusting the per channel values for the darkest and the brightest points. So it actually removes the cast that was in the image. There's a severe blue cast in that image, and so now that's gone. And so you get the background of the wall and things like that have now appeared. Great. Okay. What I can also do here is I've got sampling. So if I
Sorry, before we go on, go back. Can we just take a look at the individual red, green, and blue channels in here? Because then anybody who's watching after doing the auto, So if anybody's not understanding that,
you can see red, how red's gone green.
Right. So those black and white points have been moved to the edges of their respective histograms for each of the channels, as opposed to one that's just on the Luma channel, which would still shift the colors.
Exactly. So
and even in
by
here,
doing it that way, we get rid of the color cast, but still get contrast back and a more pleasing image.
Right. And even here, because there is still a little bit of a color cast, a little bit yellow, and you can see it looking at the histogram up at the top, that the blue spike is off to the left. We could compensate for that by pulling the white point in a little bit on this curve, which maybe I'm messing your demo here, but you could do that.
So so you can choose this. Now, since you have curves, you have per channel control. So you can decide to do whatever you want to those things. If you felt that it was too yellow, for example, then we can manipulate that either by counteracting the red and the green, or however you wish to actually manipulate your yellows.
Right.
So that is, I just want to show that it's a very simple one-click way of getting rid of the color cast and introducing contrast.
Yep.
But it's a starting point, as you point out. Mm-hmm. And then you saw these overlays, so it gives you a sense for how much the individual channels have moved from the default.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting just as a user to see, when you do it that way, how different the red, green, and blue is. And the red and green are pretty similar, but the blue is way different. So that really does tell you a lot about the original image and what you're working with.
Mm-hmm. Exactly right. Okay, so if we want, instead of using the automatic one, is to use sampling, I can pick black and white points here. So I can pick a black point here and pick a white point maybe on this dress here, and then get my own basically interpretation of that. Now this gets a little bit more overdriven, as you can see how much the blue moved. So maybe it moved it too much, or maybe I want to just adjust it in some other way, but I have control over that later. So I have the ability to sample or use automatic adjustments to correct for casts. I can also use this target indicator. I can pick, say a blue here, and it will put points on the curve. I think I missed. There we go. There we go.
Okay.
And so I get a point on the curves, on all of the curves. You can see the little point here. And so if I want to manipulate the blue for whatever reason, bring it up or bring it down, then I can just move this around and manipulate that type of blue.
Okay.
So a lot of power there. And also, these are really unusual controls up here. They're very, they give you a lot of precision over the results. So this first one, which is called gamma, basically says how to interpret the image coming in. Do you want to interpret the image as a gamma corrected image, or do you want to work with it linearly? So raw images, of course, are linear automatically, but we're used to seeing images in a gamma corrected way. So sometimes if you're going to work with an image, you want to have gamma corrected data and sometimes linear data. And the reason is that gamma corrected data kind of squashes the highlights to give you more range in the darks, but linear essentially reverses that so that you have an equal amount of bright area. So you're working in a bright area image, maybe you want to work with it in a linear fashion. So that's what this control does.
Is that would be a general approach to it? If your image is really bright to begin with, go linear. If your image is neutral or dark to begin with, go gamma?
I think that can help in a lot of cases. It just depends in part on what you want to do and how you like to view the image. I think for some of us, we're just so used to looking in a certain way that maybe it would be confusing to see it the other way. But I think once you get used to looking at things linearly, you get a lot of power out of it.
Okay.
Now, this one called equal RGB is interesting too. So that switches between luminance and equal RGB. And again, curves generally operate this combined channel where the red, the green, and the blue values are equally weighted. So that if you move this point somewhere, you're actually manipulating the red, the green, and blue the same amount. And sometimes that's a good idea, but if you have a cast and as a cast you want to keep, for example, you haven't removed it, when you do that, it'll skew the image a fair amount. If you want to work in luminance instead, that's very hard to do in most curves. In fact, in Photoshop, you look at the books, what they'll tell you to do is bring the image into Photoshop, convert to LAB, bring up a curve, manipulate the L, switch it back, keep going. Right? That's a really, really elaborate process. Or if you like, in raw power, you can click that button there, it does the same thing. So it basically processes the image in luminance, in LAB, but you work with it just as like it was a normal RGB image from your standpoint. So you get the full access to luminance just by clicking that button.
Very cool. Interesting.
Okay.
Definitely some advanced tools.
And the last thing is, a nice sharpener. It's a different sharpener than you've seen in some other applications because it doesn't tend to sharpen noise. So it's kind of a simple, nice sharpener to add to the toolbox.
Okay. Very good.
All right. So the last thing I wanted to show you was something we didn't bring up early on, which is that Raw Power is not just a plugin, it turns out, just an extension. It's also a standalone application.
Okay.
And you can see it right here. So this is Raw Power as a standalone application. It opens up raw files. It'll open up actually any kind of image files, but obviously it's best at raw files. Mm-hmm. It is also non-destructive. So this image I adjusted this earlier using, again, Boost because it's an extremely bright image. If I hold the M key down, you can see what it originally was.
M for master.
M for master. Yes. Some things we don't change.
There you go. Good.
So it's a non-destructive standalone application, has all the same features as the extension, along with the ability to export images to 16-bit TIFFs. So you get that along with the extension. So if you're not using Photos, for example, but you like how Apple's decode of images are, or perhaps you liked Aperture's raw fine-tuning controls, then Raw Power is a very easy way to just bring up an image, open it up, adjust it the way you like, and then export a TIFF to bring into your preferred photo editor.
Okay. So do you have a plugin architecture or plugin set up for Lightroom?
No, it turns out that Lightroom's plugin API is very restrictive in some ways. It doesn't have a way of passing the raw file to an application or a separate external editor and then bring back the rendered image. So that's something Aperture's plugin API lets you do, and that's why there were some raw plugins
actually
for that.
You do, but
Lightroom one doesn't. You can have an export plugin, but that's a little different, and it's a multi-step process. So I haven't gotten to the point of implementing something like that.
Take a look at Macphun's HDR app, their HDR 2017 app, because they have that, and it sends the file back. And also, I think one of the DxO Optics Pro does that, where you can send the raw file from Lightroom, and it does bring the adjusted file back as a TIFF or whatever you send it back to. It doesn't necessarily drop it into the exact same album you were in, but it's there, and it goes into its own custom, brought back from DxO Optics Pro kind of a thing. You can drag it into the right place. But it does give you the ability to send off that raw file so that you can make the adjustments.
Okay. I looked at it earlier, and when I looked at that, there wasn't a way of doing it as seamlessly as what I was hoping to achieve, but maybe it's gotten better recently. I would definitely take a look at that.
Yeah, it's worth looking at because certainly, like you're saying, if someone just likes the raw engine in Apple's, in macOS, then that's great. If you're working in Lightroom, that means you're using Adobe's raw decoder. But if you have an image that just looks better in Apple's, or you just like the way it looks, whatever, then to be able to send it out that easily and get it back again, that's fantastic. It gives you that capability. I like that a lot. So, very good. Cool.
All right.
Excellent.
So so that's Raw Power.
Okay.
It's I think it'll be actually a really nice addition to a lot of people's toolbox.
Awesome. Very good. It is. It is great to see some of that power coming back to the world of photos, because obviously it's one of those things a lot of people are missing. People who are using Photos are just missing out on all this capability. So it's good to have it there. So thank you for bringing that back. So what does this little nugget of wonder cost?
So it'll be available at a promotional price of $9.99, and then it'll go to $19.99 at some point in the future.
Okay, so buy early. Now, we don't have a release date, but we also don't have a release date for this podcast. So if you're watching this podcast, audience, then that means that the plugin is available or will be within days. We're going to try and time this as close as we can to the release of it, and the release of this is hinged on an Apple update that is pending as well.
That's right.
Right. So
that's right. Since I sit on top of Apple's raw engine, as they make changes, I've made changes so that the two will go together and get the best results.
Right. Fantastic. Well, very exciting. So viewers, listeners, as you're listening and watching this now, if you run, don't walk to get the plugin in the Mac App Store so that you can get it at that $9.99 price. Or, of course, I'm sure Nik wouldn't mind if you waited a little bit and paid twice as much. I think that'd be okay for him too. Right on. Thank you so much. So that's beautiful. That is a really good app. It's really great to see all of this functionality coming back. So thank you for bringing that to us.
Thank you.
Well, let us move on then. I do believe the next part of our show is the guest pick. So you, as our guest, get to pick your favorite. Stop smiling like that. You get to pick your favorite photo editing app on any platform, desktop or mobile, as long as it's not yours. We know what you're going to pick, don't we?
I'm going to pick Aperture. Yes. But it's why I'm doing this, though, is because Aperture was and is a great application, and it has a lot of really valuable features which just aren't available to people anymore. So that's why I'm doing this, is to bring that functionality from Aperture to Photos, and also as a standalone application for people who miss that.
Sure, so, absolutely. Yep, that is true. So you're going to work on a dam next?
On a dam?
An asset management, since that's what...
I'm sorry.
Well, I don't know. Not the thing to hold back water, but
exactly.
Digital asset management. Are you going to work on that next so that people who are clinging on to Aperture have somewhere else to go?
I think that would be a really great thing to get. Yeah, but we'll see.
It would be a great thing. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Okay. Well, Aperture, it always will have a soft spot in our hearts. It was a great app. Right on, Nik. Where can our viewers learn more about your app, learn more about your company, and learn more about you?
So the website is gentlemencoders.com, plural. And there's information there. There's FAQs and all kinds of stuff to look at there.
Excellent.
And I think that's the best way to go. I have a Twitter handle at gentcoders.
Okay.
And
great.
That's about it.
How are since the company is just you, right? There's no team behind you.
Right.
So support, that's always an issue that comes up. And obviously many developers in the App Store are lone wolves like you, just on your own doing it. Obviously, all tech support is going to go through you. If people have questions, what is best? Is there an email link in the app, or should they use Twitter? How would you prefer that people reach out with questions and or suggestions of the app?
And so there's will be 3 different ways. So you'll be able to do it from the website. You'll be able to do it from, let's say, Twitter, but also in the application itself, actually connected to the little raw power icon in the bottom corner, there's actually a report and issue button. Okay. And so if you click the report and issue button, it'll bring up an email window, and you can send me feedback directly. And I'd love to hear from people. Great.
Very good. Thank you very much. Well, that wraps up our guest portion of the show. Thank you so much, Nik. Really appreciate you coming on. It's great to have you on here. Me.
Absolutely.
Really, and I can't wait to get my hands on it. And I can't play with it yet because I don't have the beta OS, so I got to wait like everybody else for the macOS to get updated so I can get my mitts on it. But it looks exciting. It's very cool. We'll make sure that you should do a post on photoapps.expert as well once we have this thing up and running. Make sure that we can get you exposed on there too. All right, Nik, thanks a bunch. I'll talk to you soon.
All right, thank you.
Bye. All right, folks. So there you have it. That is raw power from our friend, the gentleman coder, Nik Bhatt. It's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. So as I said, I'm not going to do a customary opinion wrap up, except to say this thing rocks. Go get it for $10. Come on, seriously. You get that power back into photos that you've been missing, and what we just saw in here is absolutely impressive. So I'm looking forward to playing with it myself for sure. So that does bring us to the end of another episode of TWiP Apps. I'm your host, PhotoJoseph, and you can find me on the socials at PhotoJoseph, as well as on my website at photoapps.expert. Special thanks to our sponsor for the support of this episode. And also be sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and to visit our website at thisweekinphoto.com, where you can sign up for our email list and to be notified of new episodes and to get exclusive subscriber bonuses. If you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to comment, like, and subscribe. And if you're watching on our website, you can subscribe to the show using the subscribe box on this page. If you have feedback, suggestions, or comments about the show, you can reach me, PhotoJoseph, directly by using our contact form. Just click that Contact Us menu item at the top of our webpage, and that will come to me directly. And finally, if you're a developer and would like to be a guest on the TWiP App Show, click that same Contact Us button at thisweekinphoto.com and let us know what you got. And with that, it's time to put your lens cap back on and go edit some photos.